Nick Script, P2W Fantasy Podcast, live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What's up, guys? I am moving today, so I have a day off. Just dropped my daughter off, went to the gym, lifted super heavy, trying to get, swole to fight and stuff. Have a bunch of moving today, so I have the next couple days off. So you best believe I'm gonna sneak in some content because I'm about that life and I am always pushing some stuff out. But I wanted to do a quick stream talking about some content that I put out this week, discussing it live, discussing it for the podcast because I, don't count on everybody catching everything all the time. And the stuff I put out, I think might be valuable in some sort of sense. So appreciate you guys tuning in. Go tell your friends that we're live here and let's fucking get it.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best, don't trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win.
All right, so I have a couple different pieces of content to share out with you guys here today to discuss a little bit more, maybe some random stuff. It's mostly some player spotlights, but another topic of discussion that I posted yesterday regarding quarterbacks. But quick side note, because I'd be posting stuff out there to content creators, little pieces of advice. Not that I'm anybody that needs to tell anybody what to do or I'm super experienced or I'm at any sort of level. But I feel like, me as a content creator back in the day didn't get tons and tons of advice on the open, but be humble as you grow and develop into a bigger content creator. I think people get very caught up in their follower count and the site they might work for and shit, and it creates these big egos sometimes. And I think just always remember where you come from and remember that you're out here to help people win fantasy football championships and be better at a game at the end of the day. A lot of people have a weird energy that you would never fucking have in real life, ever have in real life. And it comes from like getting followers and working for sites and shit. But be humble, be a good person, because that's very easy. And people gravitate towards people that are real and are good people at the end of the day. And there's a lot of great people in this space. I have a lot of good relationships. You just catch some weird vibes sometimes. But again, be humble as you get bigger and develop as a content creator. But let's get into some actual fantasy football stuff. Starting out with a little bit of a thread that I put together yesterday. History of the rushing quarterback for fantasy football. I had 5 years of data. I looked at the impacts of quarterbacks that rush for 300 plus rushing yards and 500 plus rushing yards and looked at, who could hit these numbers in 2023. Mentioned this is quote unquote the Konami code quarterback for fantasy football. We typically, look at these guys and say, hey, because of the rushing numbers, they have a safer floor and an elevated ceiling because they have the opportunity to score in a stat field that, pocket passers don't as much. So we want those rushing quarterbacks typically in fantasy football due to that. Obviously there's variables that I'll show in the data set here. Beyond the rushing stats, rushing is just one thing, but of course we got to factor in for quarterbacks in fantasy football, simple stuff, passing yards, completions, passing touchdowns, interceptions, stuff that's all included in the data set. So I actually want to scroll down. This was, let's see how it looks on the screen. I think it's cut off at the top a little bit, but this was the data set for 300 plus rushing yard quarterbacks from 2018 through 2022. So you could see all of the averages for everything. I have that statted out. If you want to check it out more, it is on Twitter. But for those 42 quarterbacks, they averaged an 11.6 overall quarterback finish. So that's a top 12 quarterback. We know for most leagues, a quarterback one refers to a quarterback that finishes top 12. And then they averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game. So any quarterback that hit 300 plus rushing yards 2018 through 2022, if we average them out, those are good numbers. Then if we look to the 500 plus rushing stat, obviously this data set is much smaller. You have your common names on here that pop up very often, but obviously this adds a lot more to their statistics as a quarterback when they hit that sort of rushing stat. So that sample size is 18 quarterbacks again, 2018 through 2022. So we said like 11-ish finish for the quarterback position. If they hit 500 plus rushing yards, though, 8.94 quarterback overall finish. And that had some outliers within it, but obviously a better finish. And then the fantasy points per game, 20.99. So we project forward. Who can hit these numbers in 2023? So who could be those guys that hit 500 plus rushing yards? I missed Josh Allen on this, and immediately people were like, dude, what about fucking Josh Allen? And that was just me trying to spit this out fast. I actually wrote this thread, and it came out on Twitter like 5 times, which drove me fucking nuts. But if we look forward, who could hit 500 plus rushing yards? Josh Allen, who I miss, of course, is on there. Jalen Hurts, of course, should be on there as well after the season we've seen with him. Justin Fields just led the league in rushing. He should be on that list as well, even if he regresses due to having better pass catching options in that department. Lamar Jackson, your typical, quarterback. We fit into this sort of category. Daniel Jones, he's a little bit sneaky here too. Just mentioning him, I think we look at him as a rushing dual threat quarterback in a certain sense, but we don't look at him like we look at Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields, and I don't think he'll hit those sort of ceilings, but he is in this category. And then I'll also mention Anthony Richardson. We're not sure if he is going to be the starter day one, if he starts the entire season, but we know that's in his bag, the high rushing ceiling, and that's why he's so appealing in those rookie drafts. Then if we also project a little bit further, so guys that will hit 300 plus, but they'll be under 500 yards, Deshaun Watson, he's been a guy through time, and I'll talk about him in a little bit, who has done this. He's done he's hit these numbers in the past, and we saw a small sample size of him, and it wasn't exactly what we have had from him in the past, but I will say that he is a guy that fits directly into that category. Patrick Mahomes, we don't look at him as this huge rushing quarterback, but he does hit these numbers pretty consistently to be in that 300 plus range. And then we have quarterbacks that can possibly hit 300 plus rushing yards. Trevor Lawrence, Russell Wilson, Geno Smith, Kyler Murray. We obviously are not sure about his health, his status, so that's dependent on that. And Trey Lance, if he does indeed win the job at the beginning or halfway through the season or after a couple games, whatever the case is, he's a guy that can fit into this category. So very simple. Seeing the data sets for rushing quarterbacks makes it evident how valuable they are for fantasy football. So for a quarterback not to be mobile, they have to have high statistics in a different category. And for those rushing quarterbacks, those are guys we want to target in our fantasy football leagues, especially in those redraft leagues where maybe we don't want to bite early on the Jalen Hurts or the Patrick Mahomes quarterbacks, but maybe we look for a guy like Anthony Richardson or Daniel Jones just because we know that they have that elevated ceiling and a safer floor because of it. All right, so player spotlight that we'll look at first. We have a series of player spotlights. Is going to be Nick Chubb. So I feel like Nick Chubb consistently does things well, but doesn't consistently get the hype maybe he deserves because he doesn't like catch passes and have the same sort of ceiling that Christian McCaffrey, maybe Austin Eckler has. But if we look historically at Nick Chubb, very simple graphic there. There he is, right next to the P2W fantasy logo, badass logo. He's never averaged under 5 yards per carry in a season. That's elite to me. We regard Nick Chubb as one of the league's best rushing running backs, if not the best. 4 out of 5 of his seasons, he's had 1,000 plus rushing yards. Top 3 in rushing yards for running backs in 3 out of 5 seasons. Top 3 in evaded tackles for 3 out of 5 seasons. That's via Player Profiler. In 2022, I thought this was interesting. Next Gen Stats ranked him number 1 in rushing yards over expected, and that was 389 rushing yards over expected. Second place only had 263, so he was over 100 rushing yards over expected than second place. The fantasy finishes 16.6 this past season. That's number 6. 2021, 15.4. That's number 10. 2020, 17.3. That's number 7. 2019, 15.9. Number 10. 2018, 12.2. Number 24. So for the majority of his career for fantasy football, he's averaged top 10 numbers. In 2023, Mike Clay ranked the Cleveland offensive line as number 2 in the NFL. So We got a lot of boxes checked. We have a guy that's had a history of being very efficient with his carries. We have a guy that's been very efficient at hitting 1,000+ rushing yards, a guy that has been top of his position for rushing yards in general. He evades tons of tackles, rushing yards over expected, solid for fantasy football in points per game the last 4 years straight. Maybe he's not hitting like, running back 1, 2, and 3 overall numbers, but being a top 10 running back is very valuable when it comes to the game. So should the passing game open up in 2023 with Deshaun Watson, who I will talk about here shortly, that might draw less attention on Nick Chubb because it's felt like, with Baker Mayfield and the last couple seasons just in Cleveland, that the focus is always on Nick Chubb by defenses. He is the anchor, the leader of that offense, and he will continue to be a very, very big piece of that offense, but he doesn't need to be the sole focus now, I think, with Deshaun Watson having his first full season in 2023 with the Cleveland Browns. I think that's going to open up a lot for Nick Chubb. He had 36 receptions in 2019. Kareem Hunt's likely to move on. Could he get a slight bump back in that department there? I mean, I think that's up for grabs. People like Jerome Ford, but Nick Chubb, I think, just has a really good opportunity to continue to be good for fantasy football and also maybe be even better when it comes to the efficiency metrics and his total output, just because, again, he doesn't have to be that focus. All right. I'm going to bring you guys to the Discord. Go check out the P2W Fantasy Patreon. I've had a bunch of people join it this past week, the last few weeks. Great community. There's tons and tons of tabs here that I just continuously put content in. We have rankings, trading, chat, strategy, and mock, buy, sells, player profiles, P2W data set, incoming rookie class stuff, 2023 rookie draft guide. We have the podcast threads, live streams, random content. I can click through all of this, but it's all in one spot. This is a great place to be for $5 a month. It's well worth your dollar. So I have a couple player spotlights I want to go over. Let's make sure it looks okay. Can we get bigger? Yeah. All right. We just talked about Nick Chubb. I want to talk about Deshaun Watson as a player that can be a big bounce back for this coming season. We mentioned that Mike Clay ranked their offensive line as number 2. We have Nick Chubb in the backfield. We just discussed Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Cedric Tillman, and David Njoku. I think this is a very solid core. I'll have another podcast where I'm going to hype up Elijah Moore like I traditionally have, and I know I took a fucking L last year when it came to him, and that's on me. Look at me. I'm accountable. For the people that question that. I am accountable. I whiffed on Elijah Moore, but I still have a lot of faith in him bouncing back in his career with Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson, fantasy points per game, very important. 2022, it was only a 6-game sample size and a new system, 15.1, obviously not what we want. But historically, 2020, 23.5 fantasy points per game. 2019, 22 fantasy points per game. 2018, 21.3. And 2017, 24.7. He has been very, very good for fantasy football. Do not forget about that, especially with him having his first full season upcoming in 2023. Some season highs, passing attempts, 544, passing yards, 4,823 back in 2020. He's had a season with 70.2 for his completion percentage, 33 passing touchdowns as a high. Rushing yards, 551. We talked about him in that thread that I discussed earlier about rushing quarterbacks. And then he had 7 touchdowns rushing on the ground in 2019. So Deshaun Watson's a guy that I like to bounce back in 2023. We could talk about your opinion on Deshaun Watson, this and that, but strictly for fantasy football, I think he's a guy that can have a good bounce back season. The same with Najee Harris, who a lot of people seem to be completely out on. In 2022, he seemed to take this huge regression in what we've seen his rookie season. His rookie season was phenomenal in 2021. 84.5 snap percentage, or snap share, was number 1 for running backs. He was number 2 in rushing attempts. He was number 1 with his 94 targets for the position. Number 4 with rushing yards, 1,200. He had 74 catches, number 1 as well. 467 receiving yards, number 3. 10 touchdowns was number 8. He was number 2 in evaded tackles his rookie season. And he was number 6 in fantasy points per game with 17.7. So a great rookie season. He went backwards, but so did this offense just in general in 2022. He was still number 5 in attempts this past season. The rushing yard total was not great, number 13 for the position. He still was over 1,000 rushing yards. I do want to point out that he did have that foot injury that he was dealing with throughout the season. He also had a major turnaround after the bye. So he was number 3 after the bye, weeks 10 through 18. in rushing yards. He was number 4 and tied for number 4 in rushing touchdowns. He was number 7 in total fantasy points. He averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game. So we saw after the bye, he looked healthy. He got back to being the Najee Harris that we really wanted in his sophomore season. So because of that, and because of the opportunity for the offense to take a step forward, I do like Najee as a potential bounce back in 2023. I also mentioned, let's see if I can pull up I also mentioned James Conner as a guy, maybe in like best ball leagues, or maybe if you're a true contender and you're looking for a cheap running back option. I talked about James Conner, I think, a week or two ago. Obviously, the big asterisk is staying on the field, right? The big asterisk is Arizona maybe being bad. I believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that he's on a contract, or his final year of his contract. But if we look at the numbers, 2022 through 2021, the games that he was actually healthy in, I think I'm going too big here. There we go. Look at the games that he played, 50% of the snaps or more in Arizona the last 2 seasons. The fantasy points have averaged out to 19.47. So we can, look at what are the average yards per carry and his, yards after. We can look at these advanced stats, but we know that Arizona's probably not going to be great. We know that they probably don't care about his future there, in all honesty. So why not run him into the ground? That's what I'm thinking when it comes to James Conner. His running back competition, Keontae Ingram, Corey Clement, Tyson Williams, nobody's going to really cut into this guy's workload. In the last 2 seasons, if we average out the games, again, playing 50% or more of the snaps in Arizona, he's scored 19.47 fantasy points. He's averaged that. So to me, this is a guy that I am in on if I am a contender and want a cheap target to really give me a push. I think best ball, he's probably going late. And I'm really in on James Conner if he's healthy, being a big asset for fantasy football and kind of being slept on. Last guy I'll talk about within the Discord here, we're looking at player profiles. I drop a shit ton of stuff in here. Again, go check it out by signing up. But Devonta Smith, I feel like Devonta Smith is like the guy in the shadows sometimes that doesn't get the credit that he deserves for what he did in 2022. We look at the Eagles, and we love Jalen Hurts. We love A.J. Brown. I'm not saying there's not a lot of love for Devonta Smith, but I think that when it comes to dynasty rankings, he's a bit polarizing because I see some people putting him firmly as a top 10 wide receiver, top 12, and then some people have him a bit outside of that. So if we reflect on Devonta Smith's 2022, he had 15 fantasy points per game. Solid. 2.68 fantasy points per touch, 23.53% of his games played, he had 10-plus targets. 29.41% of his games, he had 100-plus receiving yards. 71.43% of his red zone touches resulted in a red zone touchdown. He was a top 10 wide receiver in receptions, receiving yards, and yards after the catch. Don't sleep on Devonta Smith, who I think in startups sometimes slips a little bit because we don't regard him as his team's number 1. All right, let's get over to our next screen here. Another guy I want to talk about briefly here. I dropped I found a camp clip of Calvin Ridley the other day. It got like 109. Of course, when I put out like a big thread or some sort of statistic or a spreadsheet thing, sometimes they do good. But what gets all the likes? Camp clips of Calvin Ridley from me. So I think it got like 190 likes. It was like Calvin Ridley. All I said about him in that was that I think he does have to dust some rust off when it comes to getting back on the field and back to being a big, fantasy football and wide receiver impact. He might have to dust some rust off, but you don't forget your skills and you don't forget talent. And I'm going to relate to this in a very, very small way. This is like thousands of miles away from, trying to relate to an NFL wide receiver, but I relate to it in the sense that, I coach a high school soccer program. I played Division II college soccer. I thought I was a pretty decent player. I was a very good high school player as well. Every year in the preseason, throughout the actual season, I jump in with the guys full 11v11 scrimmage, and I absolutely kick their ass. It's a fact. I go out there and I want to prove to them, like, hey, I got it. I know, me yelling at you all the time, maybe you can give me a little bit more respect, and I can be accountable for the things I say because I do it on the field. I don't forget my skill. Do I have, is my first touch as crisp as it once was? Am I in that running shape that I used to be in college? Is my body, prepared for something like that at 31 years old to play in a full game? Am I a little rusty? All those, yes, right? Yes. But I don't forget how to play the game, and I still can go out there and perform to a degree. I relate that to Calvin Ridley because I feel like people say often, like, well, he hasn't played in 2 years, and he's missed a lot of time, and he's going to be rusty. Of course, he's going to be rusty, but he's the same. He's the same skilled wide receiver at the end of the day. He still has the same skill set. He still knows the game mentally to what he has in the past. You don't forget those things at the end of the day. So while I'm relating to something in such a weird way, 1,000 miles away from an NFL wide receiver, it's still, you don't, if you were an athlete at a decent level, this, like, you're not always going to be at that same elite level. And as you age, things drop off. But Calvin Ridley being, 28 years old, is he a little bit rusty? Sure. But I have a lot of faith in him this coming season. If I said this and I dropped that tweet of him at camp and I got all those likes, but I put under it some actual content. People will be like, oh, you're posting stuff just for engagement and shit. No, I actually posted content right under that tweet about how I felt that Calvin Ridley was such a contender buy in dynasty leagues. And he's going to be a redraft target of mine as well. We'll just see where he goes. I feel like the closer we get to the season, his hype might continue to grow. But I think now is a good time to go and buy him because, again, what have you done for me lately? Not played football when it came to Calvin Ridley. But we know 2020, massive season, 143 targets, 90 catches, 1,374 receiving yards, massive amount of air yards from Matt Ryan that season. He had 9 receiving touchdowns. He averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game. That was number 4. Phenomenal season. That is not a fluke. Calvin Ridley, being the talent out of Alabama that he was, a first-round draft pick in 2018, the talent is there. His opening 2 seasons, 821 receiving yards, and he had 866 in just 13 games. So that would have been a game he would have blown over 1,000 receiving yards without a doubt. Opened up his career as a rookie with 10 receiving touchdowns. And when we look at the next guy on this list here, Trevor Lawrence, and we look at year 1 to year 2, he played the same amount of games. He threw the ball less, Trevor Lawrence, in 2022, but he had a lot more passing yards, 36-ish hundred passing yards to 4,113. The completion percentage went up, yards per attempt went up, and the passing touchdowns doubled, 12 to 25. The fantasy points per game, huge difference, 17.9 this past season compared to 12.7. So we got Trevor Lawrence, who took a huge step forward, and we have Calvin Ridley, who was once regarded as one of the most elite talents in the league. I know he's not young. I know he's missed time, but, Stephon Diggs isn't young. We go down the list of the guys that aren't young but still are elite. I'm very, very in on Calvin Ridley having a huge bounce back in his career, and I'm all for it. So that'll do it for some of the player spotlights I wanted to mention. I do want to share one more thing, and then I'll be out of here. We've had this past week, I said it before, we've had so many people sign up for the Patreon. And again, this is what it looks like when you're in the Patreon. There's, all these different tabs, redraft and dynasty. My rankings are there. You click on the spreadsheet and you have rankings updated every single Friday, not just for overall rankings, but also for the rookies, for your rookie drafts. We have a trading chat. You can just scroll through and see all the discussions within the trading chat. Same with the strategy and mocks. I like how I can plug a shit ton of content in here, but I have all of these guys that are subscribers and other analysts nonstop talking and discussing things. Buy sells are in there, which is something I plug pretty often, which creates some discussion sometimes. We checked out some of the player profiles, but I post tweets in there, but also just graphics of player profiles emphasizing different points. The P2W data set is a Google spreadsheet that has 30 plus different tabs of actual fantasy football relevant data. the incoming rookie class. I have videos, I have clips, I have infographics. You can just see all this stuff right here. Looks good. The rookie draft guide PDF is something I update every single Friday as well. I think it's like 45 pages. We have the P2W podcast, different threads, live streams, random content, mostly just plug in some, spreadsheet stuff that I put together. And then I also have best ball content. I have an area for contributors as well to the brand. I'm all for it. So again, if you play to win, go check it out today. It's a great community. It's not just me just like plugging content and say, hey, go look at this. It's me plugging content Monday through Friday on a consistent basis, but also tons of discussions. And I think that's what makes us all better fantasy football people. But appreciate you guys. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Be sure, if you heard this in your car at a later time, to subscribe to it, because we are going to be plugging away all off season. I'm moving, like I said. So as soon as I am settled, I'm going to start getting guests back on this podcast, talking fantasy football, always, again, with the intent to help you guys play to win. Again, thanks for checking this one out, guys, and enjoy the day.